Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me here today. We have a big topic to cover and not a huge amount of time to do it, so I want to dive right in. I know we are taking questions from the audience that we'll address towards the end of here. I think by now you know how to do that, so please go ahead and submit anything you want us to talk about at the end of the session. But first, I want to start this discussion by pulling up a story that Bloomberg published last week, which ran with the headline, "Corporate America promised to hire a lot more people of color. It actually did." That headline and that story can only tell part of the picture. And we followed up and we looked at it a few days later with the second story, hiring more people of color doesn't mean retention. So my first question to you guys, hiring is just the beginning of the journey for companies that want to build a more diverse workforce. The next step is making sure those hires feel safe, supported, and they want to stick around. We know through huge amounts of research, and I think we have a chart that shows this, the US workforce is still overwhelmingly white. So what are some steps that companies can take to make sure they have the right infrastructure in place so to actually retain the talent that they're able to bring through the door? Lanaya, I want to start with you.
Sure. I think we saw this this data come out, and it's definitely something that is positive, very exciting. That said, hiring to address representation woes has been a shortcut for companies. I think that they're realizing that without any evaluation of internal structural barriers, that it's not creating the outcomes that they would hope for, right? And so, I think the companies that we spend a lot of time with, we spend a lot of time encouraging them to realize that, look, you have to be aware of the lived experiences of talent once they come through the door, right? How are they being developed? How are they advancing? And so over the past, couple of cycles, couple of years, many companies are actually beginning to do not only the behavioral work when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but structural work, committing to looking at some of the systemic and process, perhaps, barriers to outcomes and retention. And we call it looking at the talent cycle end to end. So of course that includes talent acquisition, hiring, and where bias might creep into those decisions, but also performance management systems, right? How is there bias in ratings or performance evaluations, the way feedback is given? When it comes to advancement, promotion committees, promotion panels, how are those structured, right? What are the kind of processes for determining who has access to recognition and or development programs? And then, of course, pay equity work, compensation, looking at where there's structural or process that leads to perhaps bias or humanness in the way pay decisions are made. And so by committing to this structural kind of audit, it's one way to ensure that the pursuit is for equity for everyone. It actually benefits everyone in the talent system. And in our research, we see that there's need for that because we've studied equity at Coqual, and we've done a series of studies, and it's clear that there's some talent receiving signals on a regular basis that their contributions are worth less, right? Women, of course, are overwhelmingly aware of the pay gap. Black and Latino men, for example, are more than twice as likely to feel in performance evaluations that they're just being judged by a different set of criteria altogether. Asian talent, more often than not, feel, okay, well, what's in their performance evaluations doesn't reflect their output, right? They're not getting credit for the work they do. The work that they contribute is being overlooked. Black women, for example, 4 times as likely to report being passed over for promotion by equally or less qualified peers. And the data shows that 42% of black women in this past year were looking to leave their roles. And so, there's a real disconnect because companies put so much resource towards hiring talent, but not enough effort into how you retain them.
And Aniela, I know a lot of your work is around helping companies figure out those best practices and then adhere to them. How does this sort of play into how you think about that and the advice and the way that you interact with companies?
I think that the key thing is to say that the ultimate goal is more balanced representation. And hiring is one of the ways in which we can ensure a more balanced representation. Now, if you ask companies, when you look at the major career flows, so hiring, promotion, and retention, their first focus will be hiring, because companies feel that they control better to whom they offer a job. And of course, for historically underrepresented populations, you have to rely on hiring as well. But then what is really interesting is that if you keep in mind that the ultimate goal is not hiring is means to an end, but the ultimate goal is really representation. And then you do a very straightforward analytical work in saying, well, this representation is a result of hirings plus exits minus, and promotions, minus at one level, plus at the next level. What we see, especially with organizations in the US, is that while their hiring flows have been stronger, their exit flows for that diverse talent was stronger than the exit flows for the historically overrepresented talent. So, revolving door. In, out. And the reason, it's exactly this systematic approach that we need to take to ensure that there is pay equity, there are policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows, and then there is an inclusiveness of the culture. And I think that one thing that we need to stop ourselves from doing is that very often when diverse talent leaves the organization, there is a part of the organization who turns around and said, "We've told you." That is not the kind of talent that fits with our culture, that fits with our organization. Well, let's pause on that for 1 second and ask ourselves what kind of infrastructure we have in place that might be conducive for different talent not to feel equally valued and respected, which leads to them leaving the organization.
And at the same time, employees are only sort of one part of the ecosystem that companies, particularly very big publicly listed companies, have to deal with. And we are seeing at the moment a sort of backlash against the ESG world from, often very right-wing policymakers and politicians, but also from investors who are supporting ESG-focused shareholder proposals at a lower rate. And then at the same time, you have this sort of huge labor movement, this swell of labor and union activity in the US at the moment. How do companies manage the key stakeholders, the shareholders, the employees, and the customers?
Well, maybe I can start with that. I think that one of the things that is really important is that it does come down to values. And it does come down to shared values. I mean, you need to operate on a certain number of shared principles with your employees, with your shareholders, with all your stakeholders. And I think that one of the things that is so impressive, I would say, seen from outside. I'm based out of Switzerland. When we look into this movement in the United States, I mean, there was a story that was run by your colleagues in Bloomberg saying that 75% of Gen Z take D&I in the workplace not as an aspiration, but as a requirement. Mm-hmm. And then there is the political backlash and the cultural wars against the D&I. So it is almost like the leaders of today are not responsible enough to create the kind of workplace that the leaders of tomorrow want to work in. And then it comes down again to making some choices. Which are the companies that we choose to work with? Which are the companies that we decide to invest in? Mm-hmm. Which are the companies that we want to buy products and services from? And it comes with this alignment on the fact that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a driver of sustainable business performance. It's not a layer on top of the organizational core purpose, but it's fundamental to it.
And I want to dig a bit more into that, the generational divide there, because as you said, this is an extremely important issue for Gen Z workers joining the workforce. They rate companies' DEI priorities, as you said, sort of 75% of them, that's top of their list. That's not the same for the people leading the company. The research shows it's, I think, sort of below 50% for the baby boomer generation. And so you've got this gap between the people ultimately doing the hiring and the people that they really want to hire. And how can that gap be closed? And the sort of the urgency around that feels like very of the moment.
No, this is about shared values. It's interesting because the generational disconnect, we all experience it in a day-to-day. We see it in our data. We see it amongst our colleagues, family members. Gen Z, even millennials, are looking through a completely different lens, right? They have a completely different view of the world than baby boomers would, because the world is different, fundamentally different. And so, yes, they lean into values and purpose and meaning and career progression over salary. And yes, they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, because guess what? More than 50% of 16-year-olds, those under 16 in this country, are of color, right? I mean, again, emerging talent, if you want to look towards the future and prepare your organizations for that future, will, look different than they did 20, 30 years ago. And so, we see it, in our data, young talent is coming into the workplace. They have a different set of expectations altogether, right? When we think about the various stakeholders, employees, talent being one of them, right? As far as an intangible asset in your organization, really important. They have a different set of expectations, and they're also experiencing the workplace in maybe they're not experiencing it differently, but they're expressing the way they experience it differently. Higher rates of stress, higher rates of burnout, right? We see it in our data. Recent study we launched, 1 in 4 millennials, for example, are looking to leave the organization, like most and all of the time, right? Can you imagine that? Not just some of the time, not just I've considered it once this year, most or all of the time, right? And compare that, that's twice the rate of baby boomers. But also when you think about the way they perceive bias and various barriers and being treated differently, they are acutely aware of difference. They're acutely aware of the ways that they are treated, tokenism, things of that nature. We just launched a study around gender. And, we looked at the data, Gen Z, millennials in professional settings, far more likely to report having experienced gender-based prejudice in the workplace. 60% of Gen Z and millennials report having experienced it in the work environment. That's compared to 24% of baby boomers who've been working for a very long time. Now, it doesn't mean that they're experiencing it at higher rates, right, than other generations. But they're aware of gender. They can communicate their experiences. They've lived through Me Too. They've lived through George Floyd. They've lived through XYZ, and they say, you know what? I recognize this. I don't have to accept it. I can report it, or at least be aware of it and its impact on my career. So I think fundamentally, if organizations want to be competitive, it's an actual necessity to be able to activate this talent cohort. But one thing, just back to your earlier kind of point around, kind of backlash and ESG and where we are now, I do think, some of this backlash is really just a result of progress. I do think it is pushback on a lot of the work that has been done and achieved in the recent years. And I don't think diversity, equity, inclusion, I don't think social issues and being a stakeholder in the communities that we touch as corporate actors, that's not going away. It's top of mind for investors. It's top of mind for board directors. And I think that, there's going to be resistance, but I think it really, if you look at demographics, if you look at climate, if you look at a rapidly transforming world, change, it causes friction and it's hard. And I think the resistance is just due to inevitable change.
And all of these things we've talked about, beyond the sort of basic hiring and retention numbers, the metrics are difficult to track. Often we're talking about things that we get by asking people questions about what they've encountered in the workplace. But it's often people, when they want to judge how a company's doing, they want to look at cold, hard data. It's also what we do here at Bloomberg. So what are some of the ways that companies can establish the metrics that they want to track, make sure that they're following them, and then communicate them to all those stakeholders in a way that makes sense and sort of tells people what they need to know? Aniela, do you want to?
Yes, Lizzie, just one thing that I think is very important. We have the feeling and the conception that it's harder to track everything that is behind the S. Everything can be tracked. Yeah. It is a science. I'm an economist by training, and when I started to work in this space more than a decade ago, it was amazing to me to which extent we feel it's an art, and everybody has their own opinions. But it does come down to some hardcore metrics. It's not more difficult to measure what is going on in terms of employee satisfaction, employee retention, than it is to understand where the consumer want your company to go and what kind of products and services want. It just requires the same discipline and the same rigor. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that probably, if you look at it, there are different types of metrics. They are the metrics that are the top of the iceberg. So this kind of very synthetic metrics that in one look will tell you a little bit what is going on in the company. And then there are a certain number of metrics that will give you the explanation of why what you have seen in those synthetic metrics, why that is the case and what is going on. And I think that by excellence, the metric that shows a little bit what's going on in the company, it's the gross pay gap, because that reflects all the representation balances or imbalances in the pipeline, as well as the portion of the pay gap which cannot be explained by objective factors. Mm-hmm. Because that shows a little bit how effective the internal processes are to ensure equity and really rewarding equal pay for equivalent work. Mm-hmm. And then some of those indicators that are underneath, it's what we have discussed, measuring the career flows that contribute to the representation, asking employees how they feel about their workplace experience, and then measuring the differences between the different cohorts in your workplace to see if people, based on their characteristics, experience workplace differently. If I want to be very extreme, if everybody's equally unhappy about something, that's also important to know, because that means that it's related not to the characteristics of the individual, but to the workplace itself. So I think that these are some of those metrics, the very synthetic one, the pay, and then those that are underneath the career flows, and then the employee's experience, and then the employee satisfaction.
Lanaya, anything?
No, yeah, I think, of course, gathering employee sentiment is really important, right? When you're trying to understand, kind of tone around belonging, inclusion, absolutely. But when we think about internally, those metrics, I love that, the idea of the synthetic. There are, of course, going to be kind of core metrics that they're going to capture. Of course, compensation being one of them. They'll look at promotion advancement rates. So we really promote at Coqual disaggregation. And, measurement in our data collection is almost more important, I believe, for a company. Collect as much data as you can, qualitative, quantitative, spend time with your teams. It's almost more important than having clarity around what the transparency bits are going to be internally and externally, what the disclosure bits are going to be. Just gather as much information as possible, right? So whether it's pay or you're looking at advancement, kind of years in role, right? You'd be surprised, and that's what we promote to disaggregation. With every single kind of core metric, disaggregate that. You'd be surprised at how many companies will say, oh, they're looking at advancement, they're looking at promotion rates or years in role and see, but they're not disaggregating at the intersection of gender or race or line of business or country. Like, there are instances where it's like disaggregation helps you tell a story. And it also helps you determine where the greatest areas of opportunity are, right? Because when you have an enterprise-wide intervention, it's really not as effective. If you realize, like, oh, well, within this particular line of business, in these functions at VP level, we see this. Right? And so to the extent that you can disaggregate, it makes it so that you can actually use the data. And that's internally, right? And externally, you can determine, okay, well, what of this is information I want to be able to communicate and set goals around for our teams, right? I mean, I have the answers, but I can say employee base, we've collected data. We realize there's some work to do, and we're going to set out to do it. You don't have to have all the answers. Then you may have other sets of data. The more you collect, the more you can determine what you're going to use and disclose for disclosure or whatever the case may be. It's okay, this is board relevant. Let's take this to the board. Now, obviously, in the past couple of years, we've seen companies from a public disclosure standpoint, companies have to determine what makes sense for them. We've seen more companies, willing to publicly disclose their EEO1 data. It's still a low number, voluntarily doing that, but that is something. And I will say, collecting more data, there's nothing wrong with collecting data. It's what you do with it on the back end that really matters. And on the internal front, obviously, as it relates to moving the needle, that's what matters for your teams. Obviously, that's what matters when you're looking to manage risk and, kind of find either any disruptive behavior and or processes that present risk to the organization. But publicly, I mean, I think many of us probably believe that the SEC is going to, over time require more relevant, workforce data to be disclosed. And that's per the recommendation of the Investment Advisory Council that the SEC has. More, not less. So there's no downside in having and being armed with as much data around your workforce, and then just determining how you're going to use it.
And when we talk about disclosure and transparency, we've been talking predominantly about the US, where these EEO1 forms are collected and where the SEC is intervening in things like this. But both of you work globally. Aniela, I know you're based in Europe, and a lot of Coqual's research is done across the globe. There is a difference in how countries and governments and regulators approach these kind of things, like right down to the level of self-ID and what information companies are allowed to gather from people and then disclose about them. How do you see that across different jurisdictions, and how does a multinational company who might have employees and offices across the world think about how to navigate the different regions in which they're operating?
I think that the complexity really lies in those jurisdictions where there are gray areas. The jurisdiction where things are clear, like in France, you cannot collect data on ethnic origin. That is clear. Belgium, the same. But in those jurisdictions where there is a gray area, like for example in China, can we ask about gender? Can we ask about, it leaves a lot of room for this legal limbo and for the interpretation almost on a case-by-case basis. So these are the more complicated issues to solve for organizations. Now, I think that one of the great contributions of large organizations is that they do tend to have consistent ways of looking at these aspects across all their geographical areas, and just being creative in how they do it in certain jurisdictions by staying on the right side of the law. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I come back to the French example. In France, we have worked with US-based companies that wanted to ask a question on ethnic origins, and then the question was simply, are you part of an ethnic origin in your country? Yes or no, right? And then you go on an anonymized basis. And then you aggregate the data. It will still allow you to see some trends. It will not go to that level of granularity that we discussed, which is so desirable, but at least it gives a signal, again, that for the organization as a whole, there is a way in which these issues need to be treated consistently. And in some countries, the organizations did push the legislation to move in the direction of more transparency, more disclosure. UK being one example, who started by saying, absolutely, we do not track pay based on race and ethnicity, because that gives the possibility of more discrimination, more sophisticated discrimination. It took 2 years till the regulator in the UK came back and said, no, absolutely, we have to go granular and we have to check how the data looks like when we disaggregate it by race and ethnicity, because it's only then when you can take meaningful decisions and you can remediate in meaningful ways.
And when you're doing research, how does it affect how you approach different regions and how you think about positioning questions and positioning the kind of data that you want to get out of a population?
Right, right. Well, obviously it's one thing when you're, executing and constructing your self-ID strategy globally, right, as an enterprise, as a company. As a research firm, oftentimes we're operating mixed methods. So there's certain data we can collect quantitatively, and then there are things that we do have to, kind of insights we have to extract via qualitative. And some of that is anonymized focus groups and, really trying to kind of target if we're looking at, kind of underrepresented groups in a certain organization or majority groups, or obviously looking at things that are kind of broader in concept, generation, mental health, things of that nature. We are typically doing mixed methods, and so that makes it a little bit easier for us to be pretty direct, right? And of course, in our interviews, things that aren't focus groups, that aren't kind of large numbers of employees, one-on-ones, we don't necessarily have to, kind of name that particular respondent. In some cases we'll use, name and title or executive, whatever the case, because it's a quote or something that is shared to galvanize other companies in the region. But for the most part, we're able to anonymize a lot of what we need to still be able to tell the story. And the organizations who've been partners of ours and supporting and underwriting our research for the past 20 years, appreciate the rigor with which we take, acknowledging that, they have limitations where they can't capture some of what we are able to, at least not in self-ID, right? So.
I feel like there's still so much more for us to unpack here. We could probably stay on this stage for the rest of the day, but I want to give the audience the chance to get their questions in. I know we have Meg here with the iPad, so over to you.
First one is, while it is true, obviously, that Gen Z requires DEI and is more understanding about it, how do we get them to vote so that their voice can be heard in politics, which is not currently happening at the moment?
Yeah.
There is one beautiful experiment that succeeded in some countries. Lower the voting age. Get them to start when they are 16. And show them that there is a path for them. They can build political careers so that by the age of 30 they can become prime ministers. This is the case in Austria, for example, that lowered the voting age one generation ago. And now they see politicians are young, corporate leaders are more or less within one generation, not 5 from them. So I think that's one very successful way.
I think that's a great idea, right? The idea of encouraging civic participation earlier, right? And perhaps even lowering the kind of the age on, kind of running for office in certain regions, lowering the age. It might be harder for them to get out and vote for someone of a certain age who they feel has absolutely no kind of connectivity to their life and their generation. But I love the idea of having them participate sooner. I do think there's an opportunity as well. We have to find ways to we definitely have to find ways to get younger people in office. If you want young people to vote, I think it'd be great for them to have options of multiple generations, I think.
And now that I think of it, while lowering the age for the young generation, I think that capping the age till which the politicians can stay in politics would be a good compliment.
I'm glad you said it.
Are you going to put a number on it, or are we just going to...
Under 70. Let's say under 70. For sure.
The gap in generation cannot be bigger than 3 generations.
Right.
Thank you.
A follow-up question that we did get on that was, how do you get more Gen Z in office, and how do you get more young people in office? So I know we just talked about it a little bit, but any ideas for how to get people more involved in politics?
Absolutely. I do think that we should have limits on terms so that you create space for others to come and lead. I think that that's really, really important. The idea that someone could hold a seat until their very last breath. We see it happening. This is not the Supreme Court, but we see it happening among politicians. I think that that's a failure to the citizens of this country. If you have, 40 years to maybe president, but then, the candidates are 30 years older than that, and I think there's a real opportunity to signal that new voices, fresh voices, and I also think we might be able to attract a younger generation of politicians and voters if we required anyone who ran for office to have service in any other industry. Teacher, school administrator, a doctor, someone who's worked in financial services, someone who's been an engineer in tech. Those are the people that I want making decisions about my life, right? Individuals who can sit alongside one another and say, no, actually, I know how that works. Yes, you could say that it's a casino, but there are lawyers on both sides of that financial transaction. Let me talk you through that, right? And/or, absolutely, let's talk about cryptography. Let's talk about the potential harms of artificial intelligence. And guess what? There are 15 people in this room who studied that at some point and/or worked in the field. And so I think that if we bring people who are practitioners into politics, we're undoubtedly going to see younger participants in that particular service.
And maybe one last word is, I think that we have to give meaning again to public service. Yeah. And we need some role models, politicians that embody the values that societies seem to be behind. Fairness, equity, transparency, investing for the next generations.
Absolutely.
I think that the combination of role models that young people can aspire to with revaluing public service, it's very important.
Agreed.
Thank you. I'm aware we have run down our time. Thank you very much for the questions. And thank you so much to our guests for an insightful and lively conversation. Thank you.